So, as Tim mentioned, I'm a man of many hats. I'm here today in my capacity as the Executive Director of Toronto Internet Exchange, an organization which is near and dear to my heart because I was one of the very first founding members of the Toronto Internet Exchange way back in the 90s when the exchange got off the ground. I'm going to do my remarks today in 2 parts. I'm going to spend the first few minutes just talking about Internet Exchange points like the Toronto Internet Exchange themselves. And then I'm going to just spend a few moments to sort of flip through a few points that are more or less just designed to get people thinking about some of the things that we're going to discuss in the sessions later on here this afternoon. So as I look out into the room, is there anyone here today who doesn't know what an Internet Exchange point is? Like the Toronto Internet Exchange? Don't be shy. All right, good. I see a few, so we'll go through it. So an Internet Exchange point is basically a very small collection of equipment that's put in a strategic location on the internet that is designed to allow different networks to connect to each other for a bunch of different benefits. So some of those benefits that they might enjoy are reduced transit costs, or the connectivity of those networks to the internet as a whole. Better control of their routing policies, so their decisions on how their customers' traffic makes it to the internet, gets back from the internet, the quality of it, etc. Another purpose that's evolving out of Internet Exchange points is the concept of keeping traffic local. And we'll touch a little bit more on that in a moment. But it's fair to say that a lot of our internet traffic here in Canada sometimes makes its way down south of the border, even when we don't intend it to. Someone in Ottawa sends an email out to somebody in Toronto, and that traffic will sometimes actually transit the US, and there's a lot of policy reasons and other good reasons why we may not want to see that happening going forward into the future. And in terms of the end user experience, Internet Exchange points have been demonstrated to improve their experience. Lower latency, the round trip time that it takes for traffic to get from point A to point B has huge performance benefits on voice and video, especially in a world where we see a lot of our voice communications now going across the internet, and video communications, whether it be video conferencing in the office or enterprise environment, or Netflix and other type services, video is becoming big. End users want that experience, and ISPs help make sure that that experience is better. The Canadian exchange point landscape in the past was not necessarily the greatest one compared to other nations around the world. Until the not too distant past, we had only 2 exchange points in Canada. The Toronto Internet Exchange, which is the one that I personally represent, which was Canada's largest ISP, founded in the late 90s, 194 peers peering on the exchange, so 194 networks exchanging their traffic, keeping it local. And we have the Ottawa Internet Exchange, which was founded in 2000, but for one reason or another, never really found its legs compared to Toronto, and it maintained relatively small. There was only about 13 peers or 13 networks that were connected to the Ottawa Exchange. Apart from that, we didn't have too much. You know, the 2 ISPs in Canada were just clearly not acceptable. A country the size and the development of Canada, we were behind such internet juggernauts as Cambodia and the Philippines and Poland and Singapore in terms of the number of internet exchange points that they had. We were tied with even greater internet juggernauts, Tanzania, Latvia, Tunisia, and Peru, with 2 ISPs. So 4 years ago at the 2011 Canadian ISP Summit in Toronto, the kind folks at Sierra, Byron Holland, the CEO, who I believe we're seeing at lunchtime today, got up and he kind of threw down the gauntlet, and they announced that they were starting a program to help fund more ISPs across the country. And by fund, it doesn't necessarily mean money. They were willing to put forward the human resources, the technical resources, the expertise, the know-how to make it happen so we could see the change that was needed in this country when it came to internet exchange points. And it's been a bit of a success. We still have the first 2 exchange points here in Canada, that being Toronto and Ottawa. But a bunch of new exchange points have come to life right across the country. Vancouver, Manitoba, Calgary. The old Quebec Internet Exchange, which had been run by RISC, sort of reinvented itself and reformed and became a great example of a community not-for-profit exchange, and the Halifax Internet Exchange just started up. So as a whole, it really was a good thing, and we're making significant progress thanks to the kind folks at Sierra for getting the ball rolling and help keeping it rolling, and the many countless volunteers across the country that run all of these exchanges. Every single one of them that I'm aware of is run as a not-for-profit, community-based organization with members. So it's really a little bit of a good success story and a good example of where we've seen Sierra giving back to the community and getting things going. Does all of this really matter at the end of the day? I think it matters. I was at a conference a few months ago back in Niagara Falls for a bunch of cable company guys, and while I was in my hotel room that night, I was preparing some slides for the next day, and I decided I would see what the connectivity was like. So this was me from a server that I had access to in Toronto trying to connect to my hotel room in Niagara. Now I realize a lot of it might look like gibberish, but you can see the basic traffic flow that I've summarized for you down the bottom. When I tried to send some data from Toronto to Niagara Falls, it transited to Chicago, from Chicago to New York back to Toronto where it all started, and then to Niagara Falls. These are the kinds of things that we just don't want to see happening on a going forward basis for technology reasons, for policy reasons, for all sorts of different things. And as we continue to have more ISPs pop up in the world, these are the kinds of real world experiences that we hope will go away. It's also important because if you take a look at this map which I put up, this is a current cable systems map from Telegeography which shows some of the major cables, international cables, landing in North America. What you will note, with the exception of the gray one that spreads through the Arctic, which actually doesn't exist yet, it's only a proposed cable and that project is on hold at the moment, there's only one international fiber optic cable that lands in Canada. And what this means is that all of our traffic going out to the world invariably transits the United States at one point or another. And again, to all the policy people in the world, you could probably think of some reasons why that might not be a desirable effect. Forget about the technology reasons. There's probably policy reasons why we don't want that to happen. There's the one lone Hibernia Atlantic cable which comes in, makes touch in Newfoundland and also hits in Halifax as well too. So we really depend on these exchange points popping up in Canada to try and at least keep our traffic local. And hopefully, over the course of the next 10 years, we'll start to see some more international telecommunications projects that make landfall here in Canada so we can actually get out to the rest of the world without being so reliant on the United States for our internet traffic getting to where it's going in the world. So it brings together a concept of change, which I think we see in the world on a regular basis, especially in the technology field where change is happening at a fast pace. Nothing seems to change faster in the world but technology. But with these technology changes bring policy changes. And as we move forward, I like this concept that's come up over the last few years where we seem to be talking about living in a post-world. And I'll elaborate on what that I mean in a moment. But it's really interesting to me when I think about it in terms of the policies that get made by a lot of people here in this room and in other places. When you think of the post-world we're living in, and you'll see what I mean, it's the concept of we're now living in a new world beyond something else. So a few examples. If you talk to this guy before he had passed away, or his successor, this guy, you hear them now talk a lot about a post-PC world. And we're moving into a world where mobile is everything, cell phones and data devices are everything, and we need to start thinking about our technology and our policies as they relate to devices getting delivered in your hands, in your pockets, anywhere, all the time, 24/7. They constantly speak of the post-PC revolution or the post-PC world that we're moving into. And that's had a lot of implications on our life. From a security standpoint, we've all been dealt with the impacts of the post-9/11 world. Security's changed in airports, security's changed in absolutely everything that we've done. In recent times, when it comes to government data protection and whatnot, we've heard people talk about things in the post-Snowden era, and this is a relatively new development. per se. We look at these slides, we're living in a post-hack world. In the last few years, we've seen a lot of our major brands and some of our not so major ones. The target, no pun intended, of cyber attacks. Walmart, Costco recently had their Photoshop departments hacked by hackers that had access to all people's photos that they were having printed. Home Depot and Target had massive credit card leaks that leaked large amounts of credit card and private information on behalf of their customers out into the hands of hackers and into the wild. And of course, we've all heard recently what's happened with AshleyMadison.com. We're also in a post-IPv4 world, something that we'll talk about later on today in some of the sessions as well too, where the world is moving on the internet-wise from IPv4 to IPv6. And the changes that the post-IPv4 world are really going to make on our networks from a technology standpoint are going to be huge. In fact, it's ironic, or circumstance might have it, that today is an interesting day. I updated these stats this morning before I came over, which show that in terms of our available IPv4 space that's left, we have 0.00006 of a /8 left of IP4 addresses. We have 4 /24s, and that's it. For those that might not be so technically savvy, a /24 of IP address space is 256 addresses. So it's enough IP addresses to provide internet connectivity to 256 devices. There's 4 of them left in North America. We've been talking for 10, 15 years of when will the day be that we finally run out of IPv4? That day is figuratively and literally today. Those last 4 /24s will be getting applause, for of course. A lot of us have been waiting for this day for a long time. Today is literally going to be the day, September 24th, 2015, that we are officially out. And there's going to be huge impacts on networks on a going forward basis. These are some of the things that some of the sessions today will bring up and some of the discussion points that will come along. You know, shaping the policies of today prepares us for the post-worlds of tomorrow. We don't know what those post-worlds might be. We don't know what technologies are going to come and go. We don't know what freedoms or liberties we have might come under threat moving forward into the future, that the policymakers of today and the decisions made by some of you in this room will impact going forward in the world. But we know that it's going to happen. And just like some of the post-worlds we're living in today, we didn't anticipate 5, 10 years ago, 5, 10 weeks ago, we're absolutely going to be moving forward to those in the future. And it's very important that the policies today take that into account. And with that, I say thank you very much for having me here today, and I look forward to some of the engaging conversations and panels that will ensue with regards to some of these topics, and I'm sure many others. So have a great day.
Bill, thank you very much. That was just the right touch. Just the very right touch. So we're now going to put on our deep pondering thinking caps, and have a discussion of the challenges that face the internet in Canada. And I would now like to introduce my panel. Or I've been instructed by Lynne Hamilton that the panel will introduce themselves. They don't trust me. They don't trust me. Bram, Lynne Hamilton. Greg O'Brien, publisher of CART, and take your seats. And look, this is about the challenges that threaten the internet in Canada today, and our effectiveness in dealing with them. I have been a CRTC commissioner, as you know, and I must confess to a complete failure and inability, really, to do anything to protect the internet. Would be my theme. It's sort of like robust and delicate at the same time. It grows from strength to strength to strength, and it always seems to be facing some kind of crisis. The transition to V6. You know, issues of surveillance, issues of privacy and security keep coming up. Do we trust it? Should we trust it? And yet this wildly successful success story just keeps going and going and going, and seems yet always somehow to squeeze through into ever more productivity, usefulness, and I think enlarging the area of freedom, possibilities, commerce, connecting people in ways as yet unthought. And we'll talk about what we think, the challenges are that we face in Canada, and the challenges that are not particular to Canada, but which are spread all over the world. So, ladies first, would you like to introduce yourself, Lynne? And you're going to take the podium.
I'll do some prayer remarks and then I'll be irreverent and appropriate after.
All right.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. So I am Lynne Hamilton. In addition to being president of the Internet Society of Canada's chapter, I've been in politics for more than 20 years, because I started when I was 5. And in 1995, I started as a political staffer for then Premier Mike Harris in Ontario. And after 7 years, I left being the chief of staff to 3 different government departments. I was on the communications team working at health during the SARS crisis and environment during Waterton. I worked with many of the current federal cabinet, or at least almost current cabinet, when they were MPPs or only political staffers. So those are people like Tony Clement, the late Jim Flaherty, John Barry's recent departure from politics, Peter Van Loan, Kelly Leach, that sort of whole class of 95. So before we were retired by the people, as I like to say, I went to go work for one of Canada's largest public relations and government relations companies. I spent much of my time doing crisis communications for companies like Seal Test, Danone, Bainbeli Foods. I then went to work for a same company in Ottawa, doing government relations campaigns for companies like Netflix, Target, Merck Frost, Weight Watchers, Heart and Stroke, and Canada's Man Motion, Rick Hansen. So I've been on the top 100 lobby list a bunch of times. I now own my own public affairs firm called Local Consultants, and I've been doing that for the last 3 years. I'm also the proud mother of 2 aspiring politicians, Catherine and Jennifer. So, this panel is about influencing government. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that actually means. Now, for some of you, I don't know how you are in the room, so we're going to start with the basics. You may be seasoned politicos and lobbyists, and this is going to be old hat information. For some of you, it's going to be relatively new. Forgive me if I talk too fast. I only have 10 minutes, so sometimes I can make you feel like you're trying to take a drink from a fire hose, and I apologize. So I'll try and slow it down a little bit, but we got 10 minutes. We got 8 now. The Conservatives have been governing since 2006, so here's the political landscape. Campaigns been on since that long weekend in August, which seems like a million years ago, and there's only 25 days left. Typically, governments are not like wine. They do not age well. And the electorate typically wants something new and shiny and charismatic in the window. So we are in a period of hyper-partisanship, and every opportunity to play up the opposition weaknesses is going to be exhausted. So what are we talking about this election? Well, sadly, digital policy rarely gets a mention, although in fairness, the Conservatives did make a spending announcement related to increasing broadband, but that's pretty much all we've heard. Economic and safety issues are traditionally election fodder. But what about Bill C-51? Where's that going to play into all of this? Is that going to be a factor? People have forgotten about that? That's so 6 months ago? Who knows, right? Trade's a priority, but is it going to be really a selling point with the general public? Do they care? Like, who knows? We hear about this TPP thing, maybe. So the parties are going to spend the next 3 weeks telling voters their story, okay? And not just any voter, okay? They're finding the voters that are most likely to vote and specifically vote for them. The technology they use is incredibly advanced. There are people that say, if you eat Miss Vicky's chips, there is a 79% chance that you're going to vote for a certain party. They have it down to those kinds of metrics. They know who you are. So depending on the voter, they're going to put a number of promises in the window. They're going to try and find those issues that matter to you and tell you why it's important that they are in power to handle them. They're doing the math every day on what it takes to win. So what does that mean for us in keeping a free and open internet? Here's the so what part, right? Well, it means that, like them, regardless of who forms the next government, we have to get really good at telling our story and making it matter to the people who matter to them, right? And every party's got demographics, and I could do a full 20-minute presentation on who the parties are targeting and why, but we'll save that for next year, so come on back. Because we'll know who it is then, and I can do that deep dive for you. So what do we need to do? We need a really good strategy. We need effective tactics. We need to remain disciplined with regards to our messaging, and then seizing those opportunities when they present themselves, or as I like to call them, crisis-tunities. So how do you do that, right? One of the important things that we do is, Roy Rogers once said, if you get somebody else to blow your horn, the sound will travel twice as far. And it's very true. Nothing boosts our credibility like a third-party endorsement, right? Somebody else says, these guys know what they're talking about. A negative reaction holds the same weight. Politicians know this, and it's why third-party attack ads are so effective. Okay, positive and negative endorsements are used every day. They're the reason employers ask for references on new hires. It confirms their own thoughts and suspicions, and it eases any nagging doubts they have about that choice, right? So one of the best things that we can do is to work on getting the positive chatter going for our side of the story with decision makers and the public, and minimize the negative chatter that might be around certain aspects. And if we do this, I guarantee you'll be amazed by the results. On that, as we get that positive chatter rolling, you got to remember there's a difference between an activist and an advocate. So I'm going to say something slightly controversial, so we'll see how this goes. But if you want to try and remember one thing, and I'm a working lobbyist, okay, so take it from me. There is a difference between being an activist and an advocate. An activist is desperate to be seen to be doing something at all costs, even failure, as opposed to actually quietly behind the scenes getting something done. So it's exciting to create a lot of noise and pickets and demonstrations. It feels busy and it makes you feel like you're making an impact. However, in terms of actually influencing government, they're rarely effective. So you want to keep that in mind, that creating that level of noise can sometimes prevent you from actually getting things done that you want to accomplish. And someone brilliant once said, imagine what could get accomplished if no one was worried about taking the credit. Because a lot of those things are just about being seen to be doing something as opposed to actually doing something. So try and keep that in mind. And when you are talking to government, you want to remember one thing. All governments broadcast on WIIFM. What's in it for me? Okay? So remember, political staffers got their jobs because they know politics, not running the internet. Shockingly. Okay? The ministers may have only been in that portfolio for a very short time. Some of them, if we're looking at a new government, they've never been in government. They don't know how it thinks. We could be dealing with 26-year-old cabinet ministers. Well, I wouldn't say cabinet ministers, but certainly MPPs we've had in the past. We've had a 22-year-old MP. John Baird started, he was 24 when he became an MPP. So even though they are your regulator, they may not be properly briefed. They don't know your issues. In fact, I'll guarantee they don't know your issues. So when you're telling them something, it's the first time they've heard it. So remember that. And when you're talking to them, you want to make sure in your little pitch, which shouldn't be that long, who you are, what you want, why they should care, what the risks of inaction are. Nicely, not in a threatening way. If you don't do this, I'm going to come and find your children. And finally, what's in it for them if they give you what you want? Okay? And here's the worst part, is that if they do give it to you, you have to be prepared to say thank you. Because most people don't do that. 90% of groups forget to say thank you. So when someone does you a favor, it's nice to say thank you. So I would encourage you to say thank you when they do something publicly, say it loud and proud. Because if you don't, and you have to go back to the well again in 6 months or a year or two, they tend to have long memories when it comes to who said thank you and who didn't. And it'll make your job 10 times harder next time if you haven't been grateful for what you got. And on that, I'm going to leave my one last piece of advice. If you don't remember one thing, this is it today. When you're talking to government, don't lie. You only have one reputation. keep it real, always, or said another way, your actions are going to speak far louder than your words. So you have to be very careful to be true, to be credible, to do what you say you're going to do, to be discreet with them, to be helpful, be responsive, be true to our values. And if you want to work with them and you want to build a mutual relationship of trust and respect, regardless of your political stripe or how you feel about that government. So that's the best thing that I can tell you. That's it for me today on this, and now I'll say probably the appropriate things, but we'll move on to the next vote. So good luck with your lobbying. I've given you just enough information to be dangerous.
Thank you very much.
So good morning. Thanks for coming out. One of my friends tweeted at me. I saw that he's expecting another. Last time I got up in Ottawa to do one of these talks, I started off with a little thing about Gwyneth Paltrow and unconscious coupling, and I've been asked for another Gwyneth Paltrow reference. I can't do that. I really have to go back to the well, so I apologize. That said, I am honored to have been asked to be the kind of, I guess, service provider representative on this panel this morning, and really honored to be part of the this Internet Society Canada Symposium. At the risk of doing a bit of flag waving, we ended up thinking this was a very kind of tech-savvy thing to see happening once we learned more about it. Ended up allocating some of our advertising budget to acting as a sponsor, and that came, and we're glad to do it. It's a very good initiative to see happening in Canada, and this is one of the kinds of things that I think is really needed. Now, this panel is about how to influence Canadian internet policies, laws, and regulations. So I guess 3 things on that title. This is going to be half my time, but I ended up just kind of riffing on the title a little bit. First, I have to tell you that obviously my initial thought when I heard the panel title was obviously I have no idea. I mean, if I knew TekSavvy wouldn't be in the margin squeeze kind of situation we're in, we'd be able to influence everyone. We'd cause the CRTC to build a giant wholesale costing team with deep resources that would quickly cut through its backlog, and there wouldn't be all this stuff we're waiting for that's threatening the life of our business, not because the policy decisions are wrong, but because everything takes so long to work through. That's the overwhelming feeling we have, and it's all about why can't you influence things to make that not happen. So look, if only I knew how to do that. But part of this is also knowing that some things require turning a really large ship around. Some things need to be chipped away at, and you keep on going. What my employer spends every day on is an example. It's eventually kind of demonstrated that, many of you recall the usage-based billing wars, was the wrong model for wholesale high-speed access, and in a way that, like this kind of happened, in a way that crossed regulatory and policy and maybe some other legal lines and so on. And it was a very interesting episode. We all remember the tweet that changed stuff. It's taken years to develop a sophisticated model for voice competition. We've built the sort of collect model in Canada and in other countries. And it's probably taking years to develop the collect's kind of broadband equivalent, which is what we do and a lot of other companies like us do. And in some ways it still feels like early days. Patience is a virtue when it means keeping at it. So that was my first thought. I have no idea, but we gotta keep on going. Second, Canadian internet policies, laws, and regulations. I feel like I'm a bit of a contrarian to Tim's contrarian here. I've long felt that one of the CRTC's stronger suits was, perhaps compared to other regulators elsewhere in the world, is not regulating and not always seeking to regulate the internet layer. So on the telecom side, the Commission has more typically gotten involved, first of all, with kind of lower layer services. Now, the wholesale high-speed access that's mandated has ended up being delivered as a kind of layer 3 internet protocol service, which is not great, which is unhelpful, in many ways counterintuitive, as opposed to delivering at a lower layer, but that's how things have kind of worked out. That is internet. And the Commission has also been involved with specific long-regulated services on the internet, like how you approach regulating 5.9's telephony when voice over IP can mimic it, or how you mandate IP-to-IP voice interconnection. I mean, all that is internet. It hasn't been totally hands-off, and it could never be. But the internet layer has been left, in my view, relatively untouched. And when we talked about things like IPv4 and IPv6 and all these other pure internet kind of issues, the CRTC is not a major player in them, and in some ways maybe that's as it should be. So sometimes, I guess, part of influencing the development of Canadian laws, regulation, and public policy relating to the internet is to prevent there being such laws, regulation, public policy, and letting it happen elsewhere. And that's not necessarily about let freedom reign, because even in the absence of the Canadian government, there are all kinds of power struggles on the internet, things are complicated. But it is about creating an enabling environment for competition at the surrounding layers. You know, my words, what can I say?
Time's up, that's it. I'll kill you off.
They call me Kanye. So like the last riff I had on the title of the panel, I don't know what we're doing, maybe we don't want any of this, but you know, it was very interesting the way this was set up as kind of a procedural thing. Then there's a sort of more substantive panel on actual threats to the internet, like the substantive bad things that are happening, like this Quebec gambling proposal, which is terrible, and all of a sudden we have a notice and all the things I'm not currently talking about. You know, I thought that was pretty good bookending. So my remaining time, I'm going to try and stick to the procedural side and we'll see if I succeed. So far I talked about being patient, sometimes you have to chip away. I talked about kind of calling for hands-off rather than tangible law policies and regulation, kind of a negative tracing. Sticking to the procedural side though, how can the Internet Society Canada influence the development of all of this stuff to prevent harm to the internet was the question. So sometimes it's about being patient and plugging away, but I want to try a few more themes with you. First of all, I think we have to be very careful in thinking we know what harm to the internet is. You know, it's easy to say, well, this is bad, and it's easy to debate about what's bad, but the idea that we all, you know, can do that in a straightforward and simple way, I think the better approach and the better result is when we're able to have a fairly thick debate about that. Not long ago, and this is an example I've used in the past, the CRTC decision contained a dissent calling for a sort of public defender role who would go and intervene in CRTC proceedings on behalf of the public interest. And I thought that was really interesting, but I also saw some real danger. I like the current model. Administratively it's complex and heavy and so on, but of funding different public interest groups who have different views. It's the same with the internet. There are a lot of different takes and approaches on what's good for the internet from a citizen standpoint, from a technologist standpoint, from an internet standpoint, and that's a good thing. We want that rich, multivocal debate that has multiple sides, from civil society, from the technical community, and so on. And for that to happen, it seems to me that what the Internet Society Canada can do is help seed that debate, play that role. Don't take sides. Don't try and adopt a fully baked position. Seize on good ideas, make sure they make it into public debate. And that's really the second idea. If we're going to have a rich debate about complex ideas that no one has time to fully research or think through, then be that source of thinking stuff through and putting together panels and being the origin point for ideas and concepts to kind of bubble forth. Take a capacity building approach. Enable people to be their own advocates. Assume you're speaking to and for multiple audiences, multiple stakeholders, multiple views. Don't compete with your constituents. Don't try and speak for them or take away their voices. Enable them. And finally, a bit of a cliche, but it fits, I think, and it follows on from what you were talking about, Lynne, is be mindful of the vanishing line, if there ever was one, maybe I'm naive, between public relations and government relations, between PR and GR. The Internet Society, I guess, is based near Washington, D.C. and Virginia. The Internet Society of Canada, we're here today in Ottawa. That's fine, but these days you can spend all the time you want on a finely crafted GR strategy. What matters as much is populism and moving the public and moving those votes. I wasn't there at the time, but the net neutrality rally on the Hill, with which I guess my employer was so involved some years back, was always something that struck me as amazing, because it really linked a whole bunch of things. You had populism, and you were on the Hill, and it was about net neutrality. It was kind of crazy and pretty geeky, but it kind of worked. That kind of thing. And of course, in Canada, go for populism also means operating in two loosely connected spheres. Speak in English, speak in French, realize that these are different constituencies and audiences and public spheres, and that you need thickness and presence in each of them to win. I remember in the early days of the web, in the mid-90s, late 90s, the Internet Society of Quebec was very active. I suspect it's been less so. If that were in French, it would work. Otherwise, I'm going to take the hint. The bilingualism thing is important, but it's not about bilingualism, I guess is what I want to say. There's a whole bunch of conversations happening. They can be loosely connected, they'll feed each other. But you need to have them both, and that's real poverty that we continue to see. So those are some of my thoughts and themes on the topic of the day, and I'll give it over to you, Greg.
My I'm editor and publisher of CART.ca. CARTT stands for Cable Radio Television Telecom. We're basically an online business-to-business publication that serves the professionals, people who work in that industry. So, Bram's company is a subscriber, as long, so is Bell, Rogers, TELUS, CBC, CRTC, all across the country. So, and I've been doing this online since May of 2005. I've never printed anything or mailed anything out. I used to do that when I was in magazines covering this industry. I started that back in 1997, where we would mail out 8 magazines a year, and that was fine for people in the industry at the time. It had news and features and all the rest of it, like your typical magazine. But that's not fine anymore. We used to do, like I said, 8 or 10 magazines a year. I do 2 newsletters a week. I go out Tuesday and Thursday mornings. We update the site constantly. There's already new stories up this morning, for example, news that's already happened today. So it's a rapidly changing marketplace for people like me to cover, and that's really what I'm going to talk about, is what it's like to, or what some strategies that might work to get your message out to the media. Because I really have no idea how to lobby government. I live and work in Hamilton. Although I do live in the riding where Alex Johnstone is in. She's the one who found out yesterday what Auschwitz was. So it sort of always baffles me how you would get to be that age, but and not know what Auschwitz was. But anyway, so that's the big story in Hamilton, politically speaking, today. So I can tell you, I guess, what not to do, and I think that, Lynne, this goes to what you were saying earlier, is the big, huge public pissing match that happened in 2013 between the wireless companies and the government. That was a catastrophe for government media relations for Bell, Rogers, and TELUS. There's no other way to describe it. It was a catastrophe. It was just terrible. I don't know what they were thinking. They thought they could bully the government into making changes, and it did not work. And Wind Mobile CEO at the Canadian Telecom Summit earlier this year, he said the same thing, and he urged the industry, his telecom industry, to sort of get along. He when he came on, went off the stage to wars. Why can't we be friends? Just to get the message across that the bullying, the belligerence, is never going to work. Never going to work. And this, Bram and Lynne have touched on this already. That you've got to be persistent and quieter. It's got to come up from the grassroots, or look like it's coming up from the grassroots. Is what I see. You need a bit more of a deft touch to be a little bit more subtle, and that's true from dealing with members of the media as well. You can get your own message out in many ways nowadays, but you're still probably going to want to use members of the media to get your message across, because we're still independent. We still bring a lot of other voices to the table in a story, in a column, whatever it may be. Most of the reporters that I come across, that I've come across in my life, I would say 99% of them are fair-minded, have no grudges, try to put their preconceived notions aside when they're writing or on TV or on the radio, and their loyalty really is to their story and to their readers. They want to tell a good story. They want, from my point of view, I own my business as well, so I want to tell a good story, an effective story that's going to make people come to the site and read. That's how I pay my mortgage, really, because we're a subscription site as well. So I've talked to some people who work in government in Ottawa through the years, and also in some of these big companies, and they often deploy the same sort of strategy, and it still works nowadays. You can approach a reporter one-on-one, you can email them, maybe one reporter, 2 reporters, however many you like, and sometimes you can get a question period because of that. You put a story, you talk to a reporter, you say, I think this is newsworthy. I think this is something that your readers might like. And do your homework beforehand. Know what the readers are. You're not going to pitch to me, a little niche publication, the same story you're going to pitch to the Globe and Mail, which is mass market. That won't work for them, won't work for me. The stories I write, I mean, I was at the Canadian Cable Systems Alliance conference this week in Mont-Tremblant. Most people in Canada have no idea who they are. Actually, TekSavvy is a member of that through their ownership of Hastings Cablevision. But again, these are small little companies spread out across the country. Some of them have broadband. Most of them have broadband. Some of them still have 350 megahertz analog cable systems. So these type of folks are still out there. These type of folks are my readership. So when you're pitching me a story, you have to be aware that my readership is, Hastings Cablevision, but it's also Rogers Communications. It's not, the person in Rosedale who's consuming internet and mad about their Netflix. That's not me. So when you're pitching stories or approaching reporters, just always keep that in mind. And if it's a strong enough story, and if it's an exclusive story or something that's, could be classified as a scoop, even better for us reporters. We're always looking for something that differentiates us from the rest. There's, millions of press releases come out every day, but if you've got an interesting, neat idea that you think is newsworthy, come to a reporter and say, I think this is newsworthy, I think this is why. Make sure the pitch is short. If you're going to drop an email, make sure the subject line is to the point, and then follow up with a phone call. I mean, this is basic stuff I'm telling you here, but when you do it, and be prepared to accept the results of that as well, which means it may not go your way. There are, they're going to get other people to talk to the same issue in the story. Their editors are going to edit it. Their copy editors are going to put a headline on it where the reporters often don't have any say in what the headline is. And the headline can sometimes a little bit misrepresent what the story actually says. So be prepared for all of that stuff, and don't take it personally when it doesn't go your way. Don't search for boogeyman when it doesn't go your way. There are a lot of, when Bell owned 15% of the Globe and Mail, you would see stuff on social media all the time. Well, of course, the Globe would write this, George Cope is standing there over Christine Dobby's head and telling him exactly what to write. That doesn't happen. Does not happen, never has, never will. When Conrad Black owned the National Post, I worked in that building for the magazine group at the time that he also owned. Never saw the guy, was never there. I talked to the reporters, there was no direct influence. He had his editorials, but there was no direct influence on the actual reporters and what they wrote. So there's nothing nefarious there. If it doesn't go your way, it just didn't go your way that day. But keep plugging away, stay in their ear, give them interesting stories, because there's so much crush of media out there, we're all looking for something original and new and exciting to present to our readers. Bram had a computer, Lynne had printouts, I have scribbles. Yeah, the journalist, you're right. Yeah, so that's really what I wanted to get across. I don't, like I said, I don't know how to lobby government, but you can push from the bottom up, build a relationship with reporters and writers, whoever they may be, bloggers, and it doesn't, I'm not just saying Globe and Mail and me, there's BuzzFeed and HuffPo and all the rest have massive readership. But tailor your pitch. The blasts that you just send out to go to everybody, those don't work.
Thank you. I'd like to raise the game a bit, and you don't have to follow suit, really.
I'm not sure I can raise it that high.
One of the things that concerns me about the internet is how badly it's misunderstood. One of the things that concerns me when we try to think about the internet in terms, we have two kinds of schemes whereby to think about it. We've got our Telecommunications Act, which is concerned about the market power of carriers. And we've got a Broadcasting Act, which sees everything in terms of itself, in terms of programming, in terms of distribution, in terms of Canadian content. It has its categories that are founded on ideas predicated in the distribution of signals over the air. And then in 1970, the cable system was assimilated to broadcasting. And so ideas that started out in the technology of radio distribution in the 20th century, very 20th century, early 20th century ideas of what radio could be, how it would work, started to get applied to larger and larger systems that are wire-based and which do not have anything to do with over-the-air. But ideas of channels, that there are channels, that there are licenses, that you speak by permission of the state, et cetera, et cetera. And every time I see, from my point of view, the big challenges to the internet, some of them come in the direction of access to it at reasonable prices, and that's the use of base building and all that kind of stuff. That's reasonably well handled. And other stuff comes to it from sort of like freedom of speech issues. So like, human rights commissions and all that kind of, that aspect. But the third aspect that strikes me as where we really have difficulty encompassing what the internet is the attempt to put the iron mask of the broadcasting ideas onto this signal distribution system. That the ideas of scarcity, control, licensing, behave yourself or your license is going to be renewed, and having to turn to the CRTC for permission to renew. Now, does this strike a chord with anybody that this might be a problem that the internet faces? Are we looking at it with the right thoughts in mind as to how we understand what it does? Or is this just a Dentonian bugaboo? I mean, I'm kind of interested. Anyone want to take that?
So I guess since I have a mic in my hand, I'll go first. Well, I think part of what you're saying speaks to, if you look at the diversity of the people who I serve, there's a lot of producers in there as well. People who make TV, who rely on the Canadian Media Fund, who see money from that going away as more people, they think it's going to go away as more people subscribe to Netflix. So they are very worried about their livelihoods, and they want to see things like taxes. They want to see things like taxes on ISP rates. If you talk to many of those producers, they, privately, they don't like to say it publicly, they get reamed for it in the court of public opinion. They want to see more money flowing to them, or at least the same amount of money flowing to them. And that is part of the CRTC's juggling act, I think, is that they have to consider these producers and consider this Canadian content, which is there in the Broadcasting Act. And as viewership migrates all over the place, and we're trying to figure out, what the future is going to look like, that's part of what the CRTC is struggling with, I think.
Yeah, I think we're on. It's a tough question. Look, I think there's a few things going on, obviously. First of all, when you talk about, what the CRTC has regulated, as far as I can tell, has been the non-internet broadcasting, and that's a different thing. And you know what? The barriers to entry are much higher. It's harder to get a channel onto it. Like a super security thing, where if you don't, you say I can't get a Cat B, I wish I could get a Cat A. I guess everything's different now, and so on. And all the categories have changed, and it's obviously intricate, complex broadcasting regulatorium, as some have called it. But all that is not on the internet, or at least has not been historically. And there's been some encroachment lately, I guess, and we can talk about that. But my feeling is, in large part, people are truly free to do whatever they want on the internet in terms of audiovisual media, and the CRTC won't bother them. And I think in a lot of ways, that's been a healthy thing in terms of where stuff is headed. When you look, again, my view really is that when you look at the different regulators around the world, and not just regulators, but policymakers and so on, you look at what the European Commission has been doing with the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, we look at I mean, maybe the FCC is a terrible example, but the whole kind of looking into sort of over-the-top MVPDs or BDUs or whatever, which has been ongoing in the US, which has sort of been ongoing in Canada, or at least peeking in here and there, has been interesting. But the funny thing is, all of that is not about trammeling or limiting what people can do on the internet. It's kind of the opposite. It's saying, well, out there in the BDU world, we found a model where we have certain collective licensing for certain kinds of content. And that's what lets people lower some of the barriers to entry into becoming a BDU or becoming an MVPD or becoming a distributor of content. And maybe we need to extend those to the internet to actually further lower the barriers to entry on the internet, because it's not just about the ability to distribute, it's also getting good content to distribute. And we're still in this overhang where that content is still finding more monetization on the, I don't know what it's called anymore, the BDU and MVPD side, the dedicated path side, whatever it is. And so look, it's tough because we're partly in this overhang, we're partly in this period where rights are still largely domestic and territorial and not global. And we still see most of the money coming from the dedicated distribution side. And, you know, things are complicated, and broadcasting is complicated. One thing I will say, for having acted for years for various broadcasting clients, both distributors and producers and channels and so on, is that, you know, things that seem obvious once you dig down and start to look into the details, and I work with Hastings Cablevision certainly bears that out. It's a lot more complicated than one thinks, and it's less obvious. And as we sort of migrate a content model to the internet, it's no surprise, I think, that so many gigantic companies have thrown a ton of really smart people at it, but they still haven't just kind of kicked cable out of the way and moved on. It's much harder than that. So, you know, I have to say, for me, the Broadcasting Act, I mean, it encapsulates a bunch of policy concerns that a lot of policymakers continue to grapple with. As I say, Europe and the FCC are the two that come to mind. I'm sure there are others. And I think those are useful and important policy concerns that don't just go away because they don't seem as internet-y. And I think gradually as we migrate the content model to the internet, it will become sort of a more and more internet-native thing. It's not now, and that's not surprising. Most of the money, most of the business just isn't on the internet yet.
Taking it to our function and what we do here today, from an internet society perspective, the regulation and taxation of the internet is going to just keep, like that debate is huge right now, and it's going to go into every asset and facet of our lives as we sort of continue down this road. So for us to sort of take it on and start building the positions now, to sort of say, here's where we are today, where do we want to go tomorrow, and who's going to be the credible voice, and who's going to help channel the thinking of Canadians, because, you know, for a lot of, you know, knowledge leaders in this room right now, this makes sense, but for Canadians who are just doing the, I don't want a Netflix tax, I don't want, like, we're part of, I don't want a Netflix tax, you don't understand. Okay, and so let's not get, you know, regulation in the way there, like the Canadian consumers are going to speak. So we need to help be the credible voice that champions those people and says, here's why that might be necessary, here's why that might not be necessary, but I think we can help channel the discussion and the dialogue to become more than an 8-second soundbite or a Twitter post that just says, you know, here's the thinking on it. So I think getting into the, I mean, it's such a technical debate for a lot of Canadians that they're never going to understand. Trying to get them to understand is the reason why we sit here today, and that hopefully our ranks will grow over time so that more people feel confident about having a realistic opinion about the internet and where it's going to happen, and not just, you know, giving my Uber, I don't care, right, or whatever it is. So.
That's a good working.
I'm ready to throw this open to questions from the floor at any time people want to talk, argue, or tell us we're wrong. So if anyone would like to stand behind the microphone, they will be immediately recognized. Jean-Pierre Mizet, quelle surprise, mon frère.
Just for a change.
Actually, I have a question. Is that, or must I state?
You'd be delighted to hear it.
Yes. Madam Hamilton brought some interesting points about activists and advocates. Back in
That's going to be controversial. Here it is.
actually, no. It's really meant as a question. Back in 2011, we had the UBB crisis, where it generated a lot of media attention, and the government got involved very strongly. And changed the course of action. Since then, the government's had its Canada 150, but digital strategy took forever. It was obviously not a priority. This past summer, as a cyclist, I stopped in a lot of rural areas to talk to people because there's a CRTC consultation on the future of the internet right now, the 134. And something surprising happened. Everyone I spoke to were angry about the lack of internet access in rural areas. And you could tell that they felt very strongly about this. And so back in 2011, we had these activists at Open Media who made a lot of noise, big petition, a lot of media attention. And right now, there is no such thing. And the internet being a very important part of our lives, because we're really in the information revolution right now, digital revolution. The same way that we went from agrarian to industrial, we're actually moving to industrial. Yet it's not on the political horizon in this very long political campaign. I'm wondering if you have any comments as to, first of all, why the internet is not on the political horizon in the campaign, and number two, what's the best way to put it on there?
So, rural access is a huge issue, and it's actually the only piece of policy that's actually been put out in the campaign so far was the Conservatives saying that they were going to extend more rural access to internet, because they understand, I used to work in the Ministry of Northern Development and Mines, and they used to say, the prosperity ends where the highway ends. And I think now, and much later, it's all about the internet. Like where the internet ends, that's where prosperity, jobs, growth immediately stops. So it's incumbent on all of us to sort of put that out there. And speaking to constituencies. So in the next election, depending on who wins and where they win, and is it going to be, is it all in the urban cities where all of the votes are? You're not going to see more money spent in rural, right? Unless they make an incredible amount of noise or thoughtful conversation or whatever it is they're going to do. It's going to depend largely on where these people get elected, how they're elected, and if there's more. The Conservatives have a rural base, so they understand that they need to get out there and make those announcements. The other two parties are far less rural based, so if you see that, you're going to see a shift. There's going to be a much greater need for those folks to get out there and tell their story to their politicians. And when we talk about open media, we talk about the UBB debate. It was largely an internet campaign where MPs' offices were flooded with emails. It wasn't screaming on a hill. It wasn't. They just quietly saw this huge uptick in the amount of mail that they received. And they were saying, and it was from people that were credible in their base, and they were saying, like, my people are really upset about this, we're gonna do something. Like, what are you saying? That caused the Prime Minister to come out with a tweet that said, not on my watch, right? Which is great, you can affect change very quickly. But it's not because of the amount of noise, it's because of where the noise was coming from. So you have to hit them where they live in terms of, if it's gonna be, you're gonna have to pair up potentially rural municipalities with urban ones that say, please, Mayor of Toronto, speak on our behalf, because apparently they only listen to you, right? And that was very effective. I ran a campaign in Northern Ontario once that paired up a Southern Ontario mayor with a member of the forestry industry and said, if this was the auto industry shutting down the way the forestry industry is, there would be headlines in the Toronto Star every single day that the apocalypse was here, but because you guys don't listen to us and we're up north, you have to hear our story. So we paired them up with a local mayor who said, I'm going to speak for forestry today. It's, we've got forestry products in our we're byproducts, we do all the stuff that's important, so we need to do something. They got $1 billion of in-year funding from the Liberal government that had only been in there. So I think it's going to have to be, depending on how things go, finding the constituencies that can speak, and if they can't speak, pairing them up with folks who are willing to speak on their behalf. But it's a huge issue, because if people don't have internet, they got nothing. So, and that's, hopefully that's what we're here to do, and help them, and be a helpful, credible voice in Ottawa, because we're not in Kapuskasing.
I was raised in Timmins, so I was my house was the last at the end of the road, and the woods was beyond that in one place I lived. But what you're saying too about the sort of telling your stories, the CCSA did a very effective job of that at the Let's Talk TV hearing. The CCSA has been pounding its head up against Ottawa and the Commission for a long time, because nobody could really figure out for a while who they were. Every now and then, they'd appear in front of the Commission, there'd be their lawyer and their consultant and their president, and they would say how bad it is out for small cable companies, wherever they are, spread out around the country. Some of them are really tiny, some of them are Access Communications, which serves, 75,000 people in Regina and areas. So, not big, but not tiny either. But what they did at the Talk TV hearing is their consultant, their lawyer, and their president sat in the back row, and their members came on, like their whole entire board came en masse and sat at the front row. And they each told individual stories about what they had to deal with back in their own systems, what they provided to their communities, which was broadband, in most places unlimited broadband. And they went one by one all the way down, some in French, some in English, and that really, really held weight with the commissioners, and I know because I talked to them afterwards. And they said so in public during the hearing as well. And when the regulations came out, the small operators, they're happy as heck. They can't wait for the new regs to come in March when they're allowed to do pick and pay, because they can finally go back to the large owners of content and say, we are busting you out of the packages because our customers have been asking this for a long time, and it gives us a point of differentiation against the satellite companies, satellite TV companies, who are still big in those rural communities. So those individual small stories, all told one at a time, right to the commission, really, really helped their cause.
I mean, hello. I guess, it's not just picking your stories, but it's picking your issues. I mean, it's a very good point you made, Lynne, about, and I don't know the distribution of support the way we do, but I guess, if the Conservatives are the ones with the more rural base, and if that's not working for others, then clearly rural and remote connectivity is a story that's going to resonate with the Conservatives. And if you want, let's say, the other parties on your side and raising the internet issues that are important to you, maybe they're different issues. There's been some very effective advocacy around surveillance, privacy, the right to be left alone, all this stuff that I suspect has resonated maybe more with some of the other parties. And maybe that's not a bad thing. It's saying, look, here's a constellation of the kinds of issues, here's some of our top priorities. And we realize that different political parties may have different spins, different views, because they have different constituencies. But we're going to make sure that each of them buys into part of our agenda. And, I don't know if that's a channeling thing. Maybe it's partly and this was one thing I was really trying to get at, is enabling people to tell their stories themselves, is not making something like Internet Society Canada the voice for that, but trying to find ways to get people to speak themselves and give them the tools and give them some of the understanding. Just like with TV, Let's Talk TV was effective, I think, with folks like the CCSA and many people who got really involved and did a great job of advocacy for their interests. On the consumer side, I mean, I have to say, I think we saw what we often see with these online forums, which is that you have fairly low level of participation as a proportion of the Canadian population. And the way that they participate is entirely predictable. No, I don't want to pay more money. Yes, I'd like to have more choice, etc. It's not magical. But in being a translator, in being sort of a party that plays that role of helping people get why this isn't obvious, why there's competing stuff on the table, that's somewhere where I see Internet Society Canada being able to do amazing things in helping people get what the issues are and what the hard issues are around the internet and how to advocate for them.
I'd be interested in the views. We've been talking mostly inside Ottawa stuff about pricing, access, and whatever. I'd be interested in views both of my panel and of the audience. Here you go. Excellent. What we can do, to the extent we want to talk about it, of freedom of speech issues on the internet, because we have two examples in Quebec under current. One is a legislation that attempts to drive business to their official gambling site and deprive all others, which involves a great deal of trouble for ISPs. And then we have another one to expand the rights of the Human Rights Commission, so that you can't say anything rude about religions you don't want to say rude things about. And sort of from the point of view of the internet, here we have two pieces of legislation at a provincial level that might well be copied across the country. One that involves really very large interference with how people will conduct business. And the other is very large interference in what people can say and speak. Any thoughts?
He's backing away from the mic.
You come back, Conrad, when you're ready.
I was going to answer the previous question, so it's okay.
I mean, there's different cultures and thoughts around freedom of speech. There's no doubt about that. There always have been. We don't have the same rules in Canada as the US has. Europe has a different approach. They're marked by the events that the local MP wasn't as aware about, and so on. And look, that in itself doesn't change on the internet. The internet makes it more acute. It brings it home. You remember when the internet, like 10 years ago or 15, now we're 2015, so 20 years ago, when we were having charters of internet freedom and Wired magazine was young and all these things. I mean, there was a real thought and hope that the internet was going to be this technology of freedom, and you could no longer censor anything. You would have a free flow of whatever anyone wanted to say, and so on. We've seen, in recent years, the real re-engineering of the internet in a lot of ways to allow for a measure of control. Also, the scaling up of the internet has created choke points that there weren't in the same way before, CDNs, etc. If you want to talk to large amounts of people, it's pretty hard to do from your home server, even if you get a static IP these days, than IPv4. I think what we've seen is a catching up in some ways, or re-architecting of the internet to fit those social mores and some of those different ideas that different constituencies and folks and people have about what censorship ought to look like. We've certainly been involved in lots of, not lots, but several slap suits where people were trying to get someone's IP, someone were trying to get the correlation for an IP address, customer name information, that they could sue them because they'd given them a bad review or whatever. And anyone who's involved with any telco or TSP has had a similar experience. It's a thing. And all of the policies that are adopted going forward and that we're all talking about nowadays, that are some of which have been sought to be made an election issue, will really affect that. So I agree that it's a real issue. And the hard part is not to be knee-jerk about it, is to think it through. Who do you want your intermediaries to be? Who do you want your enforcement arms to be? And clearly our position has been that, yeah, the internet does enable more speech freedom. You don't want ISPs to be the cops in regulating those speech freedoms. And when you have things like this Quebec law, it's extremely dangerous, this proposed Quebec bill, which we haven't seen, I should say, it's extremely dangerous because you have, first of all, a provincial government trying to regulate the internet.
You're referring to the gambling one.
This is the one that Finance, I guess, announced in its new budget, which was an interesting place for it, because it will raise substantial new revenue by channeling Quebec gambling to sites that Quebec taxes, and it will do that by requiring internet service providers to block gambling sites that Quebec does not tax, which would require a real re-engineering of our network, and I suspect of many networks in this country, in a way that would be extremely costly and extremely ineffective, as well as a bad idea. So, when you see things like that, you say, in some ways, it's exactly the opposite of the technology.
So you would support our position that the Quebec's gambling law that we sent to the finance minister was both bad, futile, and unlikely to succeed?
I'm smiling at my friend Chris Copeland there, and we've sat on many calls together where I've voiced many of these things, and so is he, I think. Yeah, I've been a real advocate, I hope, against that bill.
We ran your call, I believe, on that, so.
Thank you.
I'll be handing that.
Any other, by the way, well, the question really is are there bad, futile, and stupid ideas that the Internet Society ought to be opposing? And we will hear from the audience. But I cut off you, Conrad, and I didn't mean to, but just take it where you want to go.
The previous speaker spoke about how to influence and how to bring issues to the fore, etc. As you all know, I was chairman of the CRTC for 5 years. And I think unless you are in the CRTC, you don't realize the dominance of thought and influence and ideas that the big four bring to the table. This is like electricity. The more you consume, the more you need to pay. It's logic. How can anybody argue with this, etc.? This is what you should apply. I remember distinctly, it was a rainy afternoon when we agreed to it. It was not a big discussion. Then all hell broke loose, as you all know. I was summoned to Parliament, etc., etc., and they had a hearing. And Panelists, to their great credit, and I remember sitting there and saying, this is all wrong. You keep talking about electricity. The actual analogy is pipelines. It's a question of capacity because the carriers don't produce the content. And I think, oh, for Christ's sake, we've been had. But not only we've been had, my whole staff has been had. Why? Because you're constantly exposed to one mindset, one sort of ideas, etc. So to the extent, Bram mentioned it is a small, I always forget the acronym.
CCSA.
CTSA, yes, they do come. But what you really want to do is to make sure that you expose your ideas and you present them to the CRTC and to decision or Minister of Industry, etc. Because the prevalence of opinion and shaping, etc., that comes from a big company who really spend an awful lot of money and time on having contacts with policymakers, with lower level officials, people who would write briefing papers, etc. It's so great that unless you engage on that so that your ideas and your aspirations get fed at the lower level and come up, you're always going to be drowned out in things like UBB happen. I think that's the reality in order one that you've got to face. You have to make sure that your ideas come to the table often and at every level, not only at selected hearings.
Amen.
Just to add to that, as a member of the media, I'm pretty sure Bell has more communications people that deal with media than there are in this room. So, you know, when Conrad talks about feeling like he's been had, that's happened to me. I'll admit it, this happened to me, just because they're the ones I hear from the most.
But we did get one thing massively right, and I'll say this in Conrad's defense in mind. We got the net neutrality internet traffic management thing essentially correct, and that decision dropped like a small stone into a still pond of water, the ripples disappeared, and the basic idea has been accepted. The contrary argument is that give us incentives to build out our networks. Give us lots of incentives. Oh, and if you don't, there's going to be shortages. And we can squeeze the shortages for profit. So once you get into the idea that you can make money out of your shortages, then you have preferential traffic treatment. And when you create incentives for preferential traffic treatment, you then create further incentives to keep the squeeze on. The whole of the idea of the internet is to get Moore's law working for you so that abundance is the rule and so that investment is attracted to the creation of abundance. And if we can keep investment attracted to the creation of abundance rather than the maintenance of scarcity, then I think we're on the right path in terms of... Bye, Peter. See you this side. Thank you. Getting your incentives to the creation of abundance, and therefore policy that we did then was absolutely right. Yeah, we screwed up on UBB, but hey, we're allowed to mistake. Lynne?
You know, there's a lot of fun stories that I talk about. A lot of our decision making is influenced by what goes on in the States. So you'll have, so for example, I used to have some American friends saying, well, why aren't you turning your Facebook pink in response to the campaign for pro-gay marriage? And I said, well, I would have. When we were having this debate in Canada, I would have turned my Facebook pink, except that Facebook wasn't invented when we had this debate, but thanks. So I think the net neutrality debate, which, you know, recently came to the fore in the US, and you had Stephen Colbert's and talking about all of those and making it so that, you know, the average American could understand it, was very effective. And they said, well, you know, why aren't you doing that? I said, because it was 2009. Debate banks. Thanks again. So I think, you know, we're ahead of the curve in a lot of things, and we actually are leading the way, which is why this chapter is important, because routinely the US reaches out. I mean, we have, in terms of, you know, we are 60,000 people worldwide, and there are different chapters in different states of how they use the internet. And so we're in sort of one of these elite chapters of like 4, 5, 6 that are at the sort of the top end of the game. And when our folks reach out to us to say, you know, what do you think about this and what are you doing, there's a lot that we can offer them. And the net neutrality debate and others of those things where we sort of stand on shoulders and say, you know what, take a look, we are a best practice globally. So it's not just how we influence policy that's happening in Canada every day, but really how we're affecting it globally. And when it comes to the internet, everybody's looking for the best practice. Everybody's looking for that, you know, who's got the answer and how is it going to work, and hopefully we can be part of those folks in the legions, because we've just been told that, you know, we all have to turn into, you know, PRGR specialists just to combat the bell of the world. And so, so everyone here, I, you know, challenge you to jump in. But I think it's important and incumbent on us to sort of like help tell those stories in the way that you're saying, and to sort of mobilize people as best we can to understand what the next big issue is going to be, so that 10 years from now we can say, in 2016, we fixed that. And, you know, when they're dealing with their decade away.
Thank you. Any further provocations, questions, or whatever from the audience? Alan, please.
Alan McGillivray of Sierra, our kind host and sponsor.
But is speaking on my behalf, of course.
Damn.
Actually, Tim, I'm very pleased to hear that you made the submission to the government of Quebec on the proposed legislation, because I think it points to one of the roles that the Internet Society of Canada chapter can play, which is to deal with the basic misunderstanding that is out there amongst regulators and politicians about how the Internet works. And so I think that's a role that you should consider taking on as almost as a base role, because it's not necessarily issue driven. So if you're going to see politicians, etc., all the time, and it's always you're whining about this, you're whining about that, Lynne will tell you, you know, that gets hard. But if you can go in and help them to understand the basics of simple issues, so they don't get themselves into traps and corners like the government of Quebec is now going to get into, then I think in a way you would be welcome. So, and I certainly know that the Mother Corp in the U.S. has lots of content, and so that's something that you should look at doing, and so that's my free advice. But I will take the lunch, so thank you.
Anyone else? Please. And just give us your name and affiliation.
I'm Alan Greenberg. I'm here on behalf of ICANN, the At-Large Advisory Committee, but this is a purely personal comment. You asked what else should the Internet Society of Canada be worried about. And I don't have any sage advice on the particular issue, but I can give you a historical perspective. When I was one of the people who started the Internet in Canada 27 years ago or something like that, a lot of what we did was real easy, because most of the important people in the world didn't know about the Internet. It wasn't important, it didn't have visibility, and we could do what we wanted. As it becomes more important, it becomes a target. And we have the kinds of things you mentioned in Quebec. We have the right to be forgotten. We have all sorts of legislation and other means of controlling traffic that we never thought of before. And as it becomes more and more important, there's going to be more and more things coming up where people are worried about the influence of the Internet and now want to control it. So I think we have our work cut out for us. I don't know what next year's is going to be, but there's going to be one. So we need to keep on watching and working.
I jokingly say all the time, the two things if you want to make millions of dollars in the next 20 years dealing with millennials,
how to get yourself off the internet and every stupid post you ever made as a teenager. That is a moneymaker. The second one is tattoo.
Our bad taste and bad choices follow us forever. Any other comments, gentlemen?
A question on this issue. If we look at the Quebec government aspect of it, and I guess Madame Hamilton is probably better positioned to answer that one. Yes, the news came out in the budget. I guess this was a surprise to most of us. The government probably concocted this as a PR move without really thinking about it, and now they're going to have to deal with either backtracking or not. Obviously, the solution to this would be for the Quebec government to have been smart enough not to make that announcement. And here's my question: what can Internet Society do to present itself as a sanity check that government can go to before making bonehead maneuvers in the public?
I can send out my name and address to the internet. Lynne?
I think we just need to start building credibility. We're a fledgling organization that we're, a couple of years old, and this is our first inaugural event, and I think we just have to really get good and start communicating our stories and talking to folks. Now, we've got some meeting requests to talk to these folks to give them an idea. We couldn't influence before. We are going to try and fix after. All of your voices, trying to get people to understand how big an issue this is and what the ramifications are going to be, because there will be a contagion effect. If Quebec is successful in this, it will be coming to a jurisdiction near you, let me assure you. Provinces are hungry for revenue, and gaming is the perfect place because it's a sin tax. And so people don't mind paying for things that they think are bad. So this is going to resonate across the country, and we need to start sending the message to Quebec officials. I don't want to say UBB style, but we need to get somewhere like that, somewhere in that meeting that just sort of says, people don't realize this is happening. It has gone without a whimper. Like it came in, it's a budget bill, which means it's in a million other things. Most people don't even know it's happening. And it won't be until they try and turn off your poker stars that somebody's going to get upset. Right? And I don't want to speak just for the poor schmo playing poker stars. I want to speak for, I don't game on the internet. I don't gamble on the internet. But I do respect that it's gambling on the internet today, and what is it going to be tomorrow that they're turning off for because they don't, and it's not even for real, it's not because, they're morally opposed to gaming, they're morally opposed to not making money from gaming. So it's not in the public interest, right? So, if they suddenly decide tomorrow that Pinterest is a thing, I might get more excited, or I'd be able to get more women excited, or whatever. We need to target the folks that are going to hit them, and we need to speak for people who are not just the people who want to gamble on the internet, but people who just want a free internet. So it's taking up the cause for them and everyone else, because they as a number may not be that big a constituency, but we need to help speak for them in both languages.
Bram?
Yeah, a couple things. First, look, I don't think it's I guess it's a PR move because they've signaled what they're going to do. And that's a public good. But I think it's a very serious thing. I mean, this is a bill that was announced in the budget. It followed studies that had been done in previous years, which sort of recommended it and sort of didn't. But it followed a wise person's committee that Quebec had struck years ago, and all that. It's a long. In fact, it's something that before the current PLQ, I guess, government proposed, the PQ government proposed it. So this didn't come out of nowhere at all. And I think they're very serious about it. I think they're starting to get that it will be totally ineffective. And they're still kind of serious about it. And so one thing that I hope the Internet Society can do is put out publicly information about why this is a bad idea, why it will break the internet, why it will cost tremendous amounts of money, why it will not work, why it will be totally ineffective. I guess an analogy, and we don't have the same robust civil society in Canada as the United States does in this matter, but an analogy is the SOPA PIPA stuff that happened whenever that was, I want to say a couple of years ago, but
Don't get specific.
Clearly losing track of time recently. But what was very effective was a whole bunch of civil society organizations, companies, participants in the internet got together and launched a giant campaign whose sole purpose was public sensitization and awareness that this was a bad idea. They weren't lobbying Congress, and they're doing that too, but they were getting people to turn web pages black and making a big thing of it. That was effective, and but that did go through. That's the kind of thing we need, and it's hard to do because I don't think we have that same. We don't have as thick a sector to do that with, but we have some type of sector, and it would be a great thing to see.
Thank you, Bram. Craig?
Craig McTaggart with TELUS. In the copyright realm, luckily Canada has avoided adopting website blocking as a policy measure in recent years, but I'll tell you what I worry about is that in international trade negotiations, one of these days we're going to find out that Canada has just agreed to website blocking of copyright suspicious websites, and that would require all ISPs to create an architecture to attempt to block these websites. So whether it's, as a number of people have said, with gambling in Quebec or copyright federally next. So that strikes me as another area where the Internet Society could really bring its expertise to bear and do what I think has been done successfully in other countries, which is to explain that it doesn't work, it can't be done.
Yes, in the history of bad ideas, it's a really bad and futile one. And I quite agree, it rests on a complete misunderstanding of the architecture of the internet. And that is another constant thing we face, is that this internet thing is not a system that works well with closure and scarcity, but seeks abundance and openness.
The Quebec issue that you referred to, and before, 2 years ago, we had the same thing in Quebec as consumer legislation, which also provided that you could opt out of the cell phone after 2 years, etc. All of that, and there will be more and more. Let's face it, the internet is the thing for the future. It's also going to be the great source of revenue. And there will be more and more provincial attempts to nibble away at it, to get piece here, piece there. What really should be done is to make a declaration under Section 9213 of the Constitution, saying that it's something of federal importance, and therefore it falls under federal jurisdiction, as we did with nuclear energy, as we did with other things. Because otherwise you're going to have more and more provinces trying to nibble away, and you're going to have a checkerboarding of the internet. I think that's one thing that the Internet Society should make a goal to advocate that and say, listen, whatever it is, we need one. If anybody regulates, it should be one, not 13.
We need to talk about that. Thank you.
Mr. Denton, please. So as a director and officer of the Internet Society Canada chapter, one of the things that I'm interested in very much, and perhaps not just from the panel, but from this audience, is as we form ourselves, because we're a pretty young organization right now, and this is our first conference, and in terms of affecting public policy, I'm interested in people's views as to how we should be organizing ourselves, in fact, to strengthen our own civil society in Canada. What is the best way for us to do that, to organize ourselves and to have voices of our constituents heard? I think you're right, Bram. I think civil society is weaker here than it is in other parts of the world. So how do we shore that up? How do we take the output of conferences such as this one to make a difference in public policy? How do we engage the debate? So I'm curious as to what panelists' views are and what our audience views are on that point, because it's something that we are going to grapple with after this conference is over.
Thank you, Chris. Anyone?
I had something that's, I guess I just wanted to probably ask everybody in this room. There's something that I've been kind of harping on the past little while, and it's taken off as a hashtag in the States, as a homework gap, which is essentially the
gap between Homer and Marge.
Homework gap. I mumble sometimes. So essentially that is those are the people who live already within broadband and don't have it, mostly because they can't afford it. So there's lots of money out there for rural broadband, there's lots of thought put into rural broadband. There's precious little being done in Canada for the families who live in East End Hamilton. That's the poor area of Hamilton around Dofasco and then the old Stelco plant, who can't afford broadband, can't afford a computer. is that something your organization wants to spearhead? Because nobody's really done it yet. Rogers has launched they've launched a program. They did a bit of a splash at launch, and nothing's happened since. In terms of public relations, I know they do have some people on it, but there's been nothing organized from an industry point of view like they have in the States. Where they qualify people with food stamps for a $9.99 broadband connection and a cheap refurbished computer. We don't have anything like that here. We don't have an organization heading that up here. Mark Goldberg and I have been yelling about it off and on for a little while, but it's not gotten much traction. And does the organization want to take that on?
CRTC mentioned that about 3 years ago, and I think that's why Rogers took it up. But I love the idea. It's one of those things if you're going to take on a cause, a philanthropic arm of the organization that we would raise money for, I'd love to see stuff like that.
I'll help you out over and over again, too.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah.
So my name is Shelley Robinson, and I'm the Executive Director of National Capital Freenet. So it's actually a not-for-profit ISP right here in Ottawa. And so we're always working on those kinds of things, and a big part of what we face, so we've existed since '92, and yet what I hear a lot of, I've only been there 6 months. My background is in community radio, and I have a tattoo, but I don't regret it yet. It's only 2 years old. A lot of people knew about us because the same way that municipal broadband has a lot of people interested in it now, a lot of people used to think this was the only way to get on the internet. We've had 100,000 members. And now people are like, oh, you guys still exist. And so much of this space is a corporate space, and I understand that there are needs for that, but I also think that people need to think about existing not-for-profits. We're also working with CompuCore, which is a local refurbisher that provides refurbished computers to folks. So, if people want to start a conversation or even have some partnerships, then I think that's something that we're certainly open to talking about, and I know there are other groups as well.
Thank you. Marita, we're 5 minutes before the end, and we will thunder out and get her a coffee in the foyer. Marita, please.
Okay, Marita Mall, I'm also director here of ISCC. I want to back up Shelley's comments. We have forgotten that years ago, there were programs across this country that did exactly what's being asked for here, providing internet in places where it wasn't available. Many of those programs have now kind of dwindled away for various reasons. I won't go into the history, but there are still many that still exist. Yes, this one here in Ottawa. There's a big one in Vancouver. There's a big one in Halifax. They're in Lethbridge. They're in Calgary. But people don't really know about them. I think that we certainly, as an organization, could do something to build up the profile of these really hard-working, volunteer, in many cases based, non-profit organizations that are doing a hell of a lot of good work out there, that have really very few voices out there and no resources to help promote those kind of voices. That's a really big thing we could do, and so I want to support Shelley on that.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Can I jump in? I'm Jen Hunter with Great Work. My background is actually facilitation and process design, and I happen to know the lovely Lynne Hamilton for many years. I think this conversation is amazing, and I love that you're having your first big event. I do hear in this community a need to share some things, and one of the ways to do that well is visually. So I would encourage you, because we have to go do some other stuff before we come back for lunch, but I would encourage you to use some of the tools that are available that are low tech and just put up a couple of flip charts. One could be on resources out there, hard working, because in any community coming together seeking to solve problems, the ways that we can do that well is to first understand the ecosystem we're working in, and together you have so much knowledge, insight, and experience that to start to map that and then begin to use it is going to be powerful for us as a society and for you guys as an organization. And I'm happy to offer more ideas around design and kind of taking year or two up a notch, but I think it's amazing to be here, and I think there's so much potential in what you're doing, and as a Canadian, I'm grateful. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Chris Parsons. I'm from the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto. I just want to go back to Chris's question. So what exactly can be done to help civil society. So I wear a hat of an academic, and I do a lot of work with civil society. The point that civil society is under-resourced in Canada can't be overemphasized enough. The EFF, in a year of t-shirt sales, makes more t-shirt sales, not everything else, just t-shirts. They have more money coming in than civil society in Canada for internet issues. That's before everything else. So there's a flat resource difference. And I think one of the things that ISOC Canada can consider is, what do they want to do? There's obvious, core funding and stuff like that. That's one area. It's not fun, it's not sexy, that's one area. The other thing is there are all sorts of groups across this country that are doing work and have a real hard time being heard, getting their ideas in the conversation. Picking up on what Bram said, that's another avenue to approach. Another is something like what CIRA's doing. So in Canada, really the only places to go for funding tends to be at the moment CIRA through their brand new program they've set up. There's some academic resources, and beyond that, at least from our perspective, the Citizen Lab is going to American foundations. So it could be providing small grants for projects, with the condition being, or a rider to that, we will bring you, or you have to come and at this sort of an event, discuss what you did. And the final point I would have is, what part of civil society are you interested in talking to? Because they're very different. I'm an academic, I do research. You can look at Civic, they do research, legal work. You can also go to small community groups, and they're involved in teaching individuals, facilitating basic access to the internet itself. All of those kinds of groups have different resource needs, different resources they can provide. And so really thinking carefully about who do you want to focus on now and why, and really strategically think through that. I would just encourage as a really important first step.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'd like to have a round of applause for, we're going to bring this to an end, take this out of the